So just before today's video, let me tell you a quick story. A couple of years ago, I was at a work Christmas do. It wasn't even my work Christmas do, it was my wife's work Christmas party, and I went there kind of with her. I didn't really know anyone. They're sort of hanging out. I was in Brighton, people have had a few drinks, we're having a good old laugh, and there's this dude in the corner, right? He's sort of hanging out, he's come with someone else and he's there. And I'm sort of thinking, oh, he's kind of with the group, but he's not with the group. And I'm thinking, oh, I'll be all gregarious and walk around and be like, hello, how's it going? So I walk over with a pint and I'm having a mild mannered conversation with the guy. And we get talking, sort of say to him, oh, what are you up to? What do you do? You know, do you work for the company? No, he's here with his wife. So we sort of catch up and go, oh, look at them over there, looking like idiots. We all bond and stuff like that. And so long story short, so get onto the subject of gaming, and we're sort of chatting about our achievements and what we've done and gaming, sort of games, highs, lows. Me personally, Undertale, insane game. And then out of nowhere, he kind of drops casually, well, I've actually platinumed every Soulsborne game. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've done a lot of things in my life. I'm in my late 30s, I've seen some things, I've travelled, but I'll be honest, I would say at least once a week I think about this dude who has platinumed every Soulsborne game. Not only because he brought it up in a conversation with a stranger, but also because he didn't say that as the first thing. Because I'll be totally honest with you, and maybe you're one of those people watching this, if I had platinumed every Soulsborne game, I wouldn't just tell everyone about it, I'd put it on my frigging CV. Hello and welcome back, and that is right. This is part 2 of my review of the PS5 Heatsink from Sabrent. This is the designed heatsink for PS5 systems for keeping the system cool and the SSD cool inside. We've already done a full hardware review prior to this, taking a good look at it, and I strongly recommend you watch that before watching this because I go into a greater depth of detail about its architecture and how it works. This video is going to be focusing a great deal more on its temperature. But before we go any further, there were a couple of questions from the other video that I want to quickly introduce here early doors about the contact of the SSD with the heatsink and some close-ups of the drive. Let's flick to an earlier recording for a couple of minutes. So yes, a number of you were wondering about, does this heatsink indeed touch the SSD inside there? As you can see, that is the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus. So before I show that indeed this heatsink does touch the SSD in the perfect possible way, I think it is worth touching on. A number of you watched my previous video because, let's face it, Sabrent didn't exactly go out of their way to show off all the different sides of this device. Indeed, it was one of the first things that I did. So once again, just for you guys that are watching this video, because Sabrent are doing a questionable job showing this off, this is exactly how the device looks. So obviously that's the front that we've all seen. You're sick of looking at that. Those are the ridges all the way along the top. That's where the air is flowing over it. And if we go to the back, we've got that plate there on the back. It's that nice, it's aluminium all the way through there. It doesn't have a copper line that I've seen some of the other heat sinks that we talked about before. It's about yay height there. Let's bring that closer. I've had way too much coffee this morning. So there we go there. We've got that there, and that's all the lines all the way through. Another thing I didn't really touch on in the review is that countersunk screw there, and I think that's the main reason that people are concerned about how well this connects. If you have a look at the plate that the PS5 arrives covering that bay, it is incredibly thin there, whereas this plate, although it's thick, it doesn't seem, you know, enormously thick there at the top. And the reason this works is because of that countersunk screw. It allows it to create a kind of hidden depth within that bay there. So even though it's raised to go inside, the screw allows it to maintain the same level of depth across the top of the PS5 as that. That was a horrible noise. So when you do get this heatsink, of course, it arrives with a thermal pad included. Future releases will have that thermal pad already pre-applied onto the SSD, and do bear in mind that you're getting a 2280 length SSD there. If we bring that closer, there's a slight dent there from the thermal node that we've been utilizing in our tests from earlier, but this thermal pad goes on here on top of the SSD. So if we apply that on there, but that makes sure the controller's covered there at the bottom. But the main thing we're doing now, I've pressed it in, it's covering it neatly, it's all on there, because a lot of you are still wondering about how much contact this makes with that SSD, and a lot of people are nervous. And again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the PlayStation, I'm going to lay it flat like so, and then going to go to the end, which is going to be near the SSD. I'm just going to take this marker and I'm going to put lots of ink in a big dot all there, and before it can dry, let's apply it on there, nice and easy, onto that plate. So again, the idea is going to be, once I've screwed this in, if that SSD is contacting that thermal pad. If it's working, the SSD there should show up, nice and simple, and we should see the little blob there on the thermal pad. If there's no blob on the thermal pad, it means it hasn't made contact with the top of the heatsink. That's fairly straightforward, isn't it? I know it's a bit caveman, but within this closed system, it's very hard to show that off. So again, let's get that out of there. And again, I hope you've watched the other video before watching this, because otherwise I'm going to miss a whole bunch of stuff in this that I covered there. Let's get that out. Sorry about that. Remove that. Use the lip. There we go. The mark is showing. I don't know how well you can make that out there. Let's get the light, but the mark there from the SSD is touching from the dot that I made. So again, as you can see, it definitely makes contact with the SSD, and indeed on the most important part there, that is where the controller is based. So to be perfectly honest, of course, because it is a complete flat surface, it's going to touch the whole SSD, but at the same time, it's still good that it made contact with that area. Let's carry on with the thermal test. I hope that cleared up about the contact of the SSD and of course the design. Sabrent really were quite poor in introducing lots of images about it, and I seem to be the only place out there that's showing the thing off all the way around 360. It's really odd. Anyway, carrying on with the tests. Now, today we're going to utilise my PS5 here that looks like it's wearing some sort of retro iPod. It's going to be testing two different areas of temperature with two sensory nodes. There's going to be one node that's placed on the controller of the SSD and another node that's going to be in the airflow pattern inside the system. For those that aren't aware, the PS5 takes advantage of something called negative pressure. It's having air being pulled and pushed through the system all the time, utilising a large fan internally and strategically placed vents that pull in air via the front and push the air out the back. Now we'll open this up in a moment to give you some idea about the tests we're going to conduct. Now on this system we are going to be conducting 4 tests. We're going to do 2 gameplay tests, 1 heavy read and 1 heavy write operation. Before we go any further, we have got all manner of disclaimers to put out the way, because I know after this video there's going to be a load of stuff in the comments. It'll just be easier to go through them all right here so you know exactly what this test is about. First and foremost, all tests were conducted within 3.5 days since the previous test. Each test took around 4 to 6 hours depending on the complexity, and that includes all 4 different tests within that window, and then a 1 hour cooldown. So consequently, each of the tests, as they're conducted at different times of day, there is a kind of ambient temperature difference that we have to factor in. And where it is problematic, I will highlight it. For example, one of the tests that's compared was a 10 AM on one day versus a 6 PM on the other day. It made it very difficult to control that. So if there is a difference, I do highlight it throughout the video. Also, between heatsink changes, 1 hour cooldown was given to the system. So if, for example, I removed the Sabrent heatsink and then replaced it with the Eliteng heatsink and the metal cover panel, 1 hour was given for the system to dissipate heat. That's really important because it will come up later on. Between individual tests, say multiple tests that are being conducted on the Sabrent heatsink, be they tests with the internal SSD controller or the external ambient airflow on the system, with that 30 minutes were given of the system in hibernation. I went for hibernation because a number of users never turn the system off. So I want to include hibernation in these tests. And again, that's in between sub-tests of an SSD, but of a heatsink. But if we switch heatsinks, it's 1 hour cooldown, power off. Now, another thing is this is not a test for loading times or read and write speeds. We've done that already, and also all of the tests were utilising the same SSD. We're not looking at which one loads things faster, although to be perfectly frank, there's almost no difference between all of the tests because of it being the same SSD. But where there is a difference, in some cases of a second, and you'll see what I mean later on, it does not matter in these tests. We are looking at temperatures that will be very clear all the way through. Next, it's worth mentioning that the temperature sensor I am utilising down here, every 8 minutes, it has to turn itself off into standby. I can't stop it. It's analog. It has no interface. So every time you see the temperature thing, and we do speed up the recordings, what you'll see on there is a quick flick, and you'll see my hand there. That's because I had to keep reactivating it. It was super annoying, and it really, really got on my nerves. Also, the games that are being featured, I know a number of you are going to go into the comments and complain about this, are GTA and Red Dead Redemption. Now, yes, these are PS4 games that we're utilising. Why have I picked these games? Because they are open world, no loading screen games. I've gone for games that have got an autopilot, where that means I can kind of create consistency with both of these games. In the case of GTA, using a cab. In the case of Red Dead Redemption, auto kind of cinematic mode, which goes through the game. Now, again, I'm aware these are PS4 releases, and I do have 2 more videos that I've already started working on that feature how this SSD heatsink compares with the big fat the big fat Sabrent heatsink, and how it compares with the heatsink on the WD, where I'm going to use the WD SSD with this heatsink, and then remove the WD SSD from here, get rid of that heatsink, and then utilise the Sabrent. So those tests are coming, and they will use PS5 games, but I wanted to use these 2 games because of the fact they have that autopilot and they have no kind of loading transitions there. It's just straight recorded footage. Each recording is a little over 30 minutes each, but again, I've sped it up tremendously to save you guys having to sit around, and I do go over all of it all the way through. Anything left on my notes? Again, we aren't looking strictly at the temperature, because again, as mentioned, because these are recorded at slightly different times of day and different days, there's always going to be a modicum of difference. What we're looking at is how much things changed, because we want to see if, one, the Sabrent heatsink can maintain the coolness of the SSD, as well as making sure airflow is fine. Remember, although I am utilising the Elitane heatsink here for this, and again, I could have used any heatsink like this, we're not strictly looking at the Elitane. I will refer to it as the Elitane setup, but remember, we're not judging this heatsink. What we're judging is this heatsink under the cover. We are looking at this heatsink here and the closed M.2 system versus the Sabrent heatsink not needing this cover. So we're looking at 2 things. 1, the temperature of the SSD, and 2, the temperature of that airflow. And it's about the rises and the falls and the consistency of those temperature readings. We're not going to, I'm going to highlight temperatures, of course, but we're not going to look at it and go, that one's 38, get out. It's not going to be that way. You have to go into this test. Again, I told you there'll be a lot of disclaimers here. And lastly, when we're going through this system, one of the things I really want you to watch out for is later on with the read and write testing as we go through it. Because during the read-write, the heavy read, heavy write activities, where we're moving 350 gigabytes of data back and forth, it's when we left the cooldown that's going to be very, very important. And I'll try and touch on that later on when we go through the results, but I do recommend you check that out. But for now, let's get the lid off this system so I can show you a little bit about how this test is going to be conducted. So inside here, I've already installed that heatsink. As you can see there is the heatsink there, the Sabrent installed inside. We have got one thermo sensor already plugged into there. Again, I've already recorded the testing, but I'm doing some new tests for this up. And then we have the second thermo here, which is directly in the flow path of that air inside there. So if I remove that inside, let's grab ourselves a screwdriver. Favourite screwdriver for those that do keep up and watch the other videos. If we remove that from there, I'll give you some idea what this looks like. So again, removing that there. Remove the thermal pad. I had to wipe off that ink from earlier. As you can see inside there, we've still got the indent where the temperature sensor goes in. Let's get the light just right there. And that's because this thermal sensor here is directly touching the controller module just there at the bottom. So during all of these tests, this was touching there, directly there on the controller. So again, we're not looking at the temperature of the NAND. We're not looking at any other part. We're not looking at the, the general air there. We're looking at the temperature there of the controller. And the main thing being that is this covering that area, and therefore, is it better or worse to have this contained thing here? I touched on this a little bit in the intro, but heatsinks like this are not designed to be in a closed system. These have been designed to work within an open PC environment with lots of active airflow running through those tiny little ridges there. That's how they work in computers. It's why heat sinks on passive PCs and ARM or ARM processors have those dips. It's because it relies on passive airflow of vents and active airflow of fans pushing it through. PlayStation is riddled in vents and fans, but not in this closed little box here. So that's the big takeaway. But I have chucked all manner of disclaimers at you. Let's get straight onto the testing. Let's begin with one of the games. Okay, so the first test we're going to be running is in Red Dead Redemption 2. On the left-hand side of the screen, we've got that Heatsink heatsink running there. The top left is the thermal sensor on the controller, and the bottom left is the thermal sensor there on the airflow of the PS5. And both of those are the Heatsink heatsink in the closed PS5 M.2 bay. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have got the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus SSD under the Sabrent PS5 SSD, branding. And the top right has got that of the controller, and the bottom right, the airflow. And it's also worth highlighting that all of these tests in all 4 occasions are conducted with both plates on the PS5. It's completely covered all the way through, in case you guys are wondering there in the comments. And straight away, it has to be said that the starting temperature is actually quite similar on these. It's probably the closest I got, and I was really impressed because the Heatsink closed M2 testing on the left I conducted at 2 p.m. on one day, and the Sabrent at 6 p.m. on a different day. So I was astounded to get those similar temperatures at the beginning, with the Heatsink kicking off at 34 and 25 respective to the M2 internal and the PS5 external, with the Sabrent starting at 33 and 25. I should also highlight throughout the course of this test, I felt awful for how much I made my horse work in this game. I have completed this game twice, and it genuinely hurt me to do this to that horse. Now, I also get killed at one point, by the way. See if that's already, if that's annoyed you, I'm sorry. But all the way through this testing, it should be said that the temperature difference throughout all the testing in both the closed bay and the Sabrent was very small. It was only in, obviously, in the controller area of both instances where there was any rise, with the Heatsink in the closed M2 slot rising a total of 6 overall. And again, I could go for a decimal place, I'm not going to bother, at 6 degrees. Whereas in the Sabrent, it only went 2 degrees, and indeed maintained a lower temperature. Maybe 3 to 4 hours of play would have changed that, but overall it did start at a lower temp and rise a smaller amount. Airflow in both occasions, again, very low, and that's kind of what we want to see in all of our tests. The airflow is near enough, either identical or the Sabrent is better, because remember, we aren't judging the Heatsink here, we're judging that style of heatsink inside the closed bay and whether the Sabrent is better for that. But although there's no clear out-and-out winner, I will say at the end that for me the Sabrent, I would say, was the preferable of the two, at least in this test. Let's move on to the next game. The other game, as mentioned, was of course GTA 5 single player there. I hopped inside a cab to take me to the very northernmost point of the island. It didn't make it there in time. Again, the cabs in this game respect the road rules way too much. The first thing you probably noticed there is the left-hand side, the Heatsink controller temperature, and indeed the airflow temperature, very different. Again, this was one of those examples of the temperature difference just being significantly different. For those in the UK, the weather over the weekend was crazy between rain and lovely weather, and the 4 p.m. start for the Heatsink and the Sabrent at 10 a.m. of the following day, the result being that it was just near enough impossible to get those two synced up. So what we're really looking at here is the temperature difference between them. Also getting kicked out of the cab during the Sabrent run, the Sabrent heatsink run, kind of knackered things, and I just suddenly realised I had to run across the room to get that guy back into another cab there, which again, super annoying. But all the way through it, I've got to say that in terms of the controller and the airflow in both occasions, there was very little difference here. Obviously, because this is a PlayStation 4 era game that hasn't been massively upscaled in any way, the result is that there wasn't a huge amount of work on this. But that what small changes there were between them were consistent regardless of the ambient airflow. So the L10 went up all the way through on this test just 1 degree and maybe a few decimal places. Ambient airflow, 0 real change there, and are largely the same on the Sabrent with 1 degree on the heatsink controller on the SSD, I should say, and just less than 1 degree in the ambient airflow there. But again, due to the temperature differences and the Sabrent starting much lower, I think that made all the difference. Again, both of them very similar airflow rating, and although the Sabrent does slowly increase throughout the tests, I do think, as mentioned, that is something that I think would take a long time for these two to meet on, and the lower start time, the lower starting temperature of the Sabrent at 10 AM in the morning there, I think that was a lower degree with which to jump from, something that in terms of temperature will always be a lot more significant on screen than, is more classically understood. But again, I'd call this more of a draw, but still nonetheless, in terms of the closed system versus the open air system of this heatsink, still very good results there. And when we do move on in a future video into the PS5 game testing, I'm hoping to see, if not similar results to this, then that Sabrent at least proving itself a little bit. Now, for the heavy read activity, this is something where we shouldn't really see a lot of temperature differences. For those that aren't aware, when you do have an SSD with read activity, it doesn't really interact with the drive electronically in the same way as write activity on the NAND. And in the case of these two, because it's the same SSD, once again, we are not looking at performance. So when we look at these two side by side, we can see that they both started relatively similar in terms of the SSD temp, although the L10 did start a little higher at 32 with the Sabrent, the L10 in the closed bay versus the Sabrent heatsink there at 32 versus 26. Now the read process, of course, there is that bottleneck within the PlayStation 5's own SSD write there. So again, as we go through this test, this is the Sabrent the Sabrent SSD in that heatsink bay being read from, and it's writing to the PS5's own internal SSD. Indeed, moving 350 gig of data took just under 22 minutes. So again, this wasn't the fastest process because of that little bottleneck there in the middle, but as the test drew to a close, I did notice that the heatsink that was the closed M.2 Elatang heatsink there on the left rose from 40 to 46 on the testing, and the Sabrent 40 to 45. Now again, not a vast difference, and these were tests that were committed on the same day, around about 2.5 hours apart, but still nonetheless, the results there still pretty consistent, although the Sabrent actually ended up finishing just under a degree less at the end, which was quite impressive. But I don't know how much of that came down to horrendous rain and weather here in the UK in the afternoon and how that affected the ambient air. But still, nonetheless, the read performance there, very consistent, quite happy with that. Let's move on to the write. Now, the write performance here is, for me, one of the biggest indicators we saw, because as you assumed you saw right there at the beginning, you may be going, wait a minute, the Elatang started at a noticeably higher temperature than the Sabrent. That's right, the Elatang started at 39 and 32, with the Sabrent starting at 31 and 27. Now, as mentioned in the intro, between operations on a single drive, I put the system into standby for 30 minutes. And this was a clear indication that the Elatang, because it was in that closed M.2 bay, it wasn't able to disperse the heat as quickly as that of the Sabrent and the PS5 there, the PS5 designed heatsink. The result was that between testing, the heatsink was not able to get rid of and disperse the heat from within that bay, from within the closed metal cover from within the plates of the PS5 as readily as that of the Sabrent with its grooved kind of external plate design there, and that's that dispersing of difference there at the beginning. Now the write activity here is that same 350 gigabytes of data being read from the PlayStation 5's internal SSD and written to the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus SSD in the cover there, which was much, much quicker, with the whole test taking around 5.5 minutes. You'll notice that the fast forward is less used here during this voiceover as well. Now, at the end, the Heatsink heatsink went from 39 to 46 degrees, with ambient airflow not really changing from 32. The Sabrent went from 31 to 40, which, although is a lower number than 46, the rise went from 31 to 40 there, and that kind of factored in that the heat was always going to go to those heights, but it was still cooler than that of the Heatsink in the closed M2 bay. In terms of ambient airflow, that was one again where we saw, much like the read performance that utilised in the Sabrent PS5 Heatsink, the ambient temperature on the PlayStation didn't rise, and it actually dropped just under a degree, starting at 27 and ending at 26, something we saw in the read performance as well, which is real, you know, two big takeaways there in the heavy read, heavy write operations, being one, that the cool down for the Heatsink in that closed system was weaker because it didn't have the air dissipation available to it that the Sabrent PS5 SSD heatsink had, but also that Sabrent SSD heatsink certainly did not interrupt airflow in any way, which is, I think, one of the areas that people have concerns about with heatsinks that rise even slightly higher than that of the metal cover that the PS5 features there inside. A number of you in the comments probably will be quick to say that heavy read, heavy write operations like this won't be common on the PS5 for most users, and you're right. But you are going to be moving data every now and then, and an operation like this isn't that unheard of, as you archive games onto USB, archive them to and from the internal PS5 SSD, and more. But let's go to the conclusion and summarise our results. So ultimately, I do think it's fair to say that all of today's tests, and indeed even when I've started some of the future tests that you guys are going to see soon, this heatsink has kind of proven it does what Sabrent say it will do. It does keep things cool inside the M2 bay there, and it does make sure that the airflow inside the system has its temperature kind of maintained in the way that's optimal for the system to run. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know if years down the line, as the system gets more aggressively utilised, whether that will make a difference. But right now, if I had to pick between a standard heatsink inside this system with that cover on top, or going for the Sabrent, I would pick the heatsink. The price difference is only about 10 quid, depending on where you shop around. And for the sake of 10 quid and maintaining that system temperature, based on the test that I've done so far, I think it's worth it. If we go through some of the results that we saw, because remember, we aren't judging the Heatsink. I still recommend this heatsink thoroughly if you are going to utilise it. Even though it was designed for PC utilisation, it still keeps things cool. I will say that this heatsink inside here, inside the bay of your PS5, in that closed area, when people talk about the negative pressure of the PS5, a lot of that does refer to the cooling of the system's operation, but I would argue slightly less so about that M2. These are not devices that should be in a closed little rectangle there. When we did a lot of our testing, has to be said, the one consistent thread, regardless of the time of day that we started, was that Heatsink started warmer. It definitely did, and I think a lot of that is because when the system is booting, air is immediately passing over the heatsink in a way that's just not available with this, and the airflow not getting in there because of the cover of that bay. It has to be said as well that the cool down, that big takeaway there of our later testing of heavy write and heavy read, once we left the system in standby between the tests of this for 30 minutes, as mentioned in the intro, it didn't cool down anywhere near as low as this when this was put on hibernation for 30 minutes. And I think a lot of that is because the system largely turns off when it's in cool down, but it's still sort of on in some ways, and it will kind of keep an eye on things on a very, very, very low kind of CMOS battery level way. Temperatures of this heatsink inside the closed bay, although starting often in the late 30s, were kind of consistently in the low to mid 40s throughout operations. And again, it's still a fantastic heatsink. And again, you're never really going to aggressively hit the SSD in a way that this isn't at least going to work well. I would still argue that the heat being generated inside that little closed area may not be as preferable as a heatsink with the air passing through it, through the system. Now, when we looked at the performance of the Sabrent heatsink here and the air passing over it, both outside in the airflow of the PlayStation and within that closed area we've created with the heatsink acting as the lid, it has to be said that the temperature did, of course, rise while it was in operation. It had a cooler start, but it did rise. And I reckon in consistent 2, 3, 4 hour utilization, this might reach that same temperature level that this had at the start, very gradually, because the growth of the temperature on the Sabrent, it was going up, but incredibly slowly, and it got slower as it got higher. Now, bear in mind, I'm saying that in, again, 2 to 3 hours, this might reach the temperature that this started at, but this was still rising anyway within that closed area. So that's by no means a negative in my mind. Also, it has to be said that in terms of the SSD cooling, I think the SSD cooling between the two of them and the dissipation of that heat, they did a better job of dispersing that heat into the waiting fan. And I think the overall temperature that we sensed inside there with the thermosensor just before hitting the fan showed that it didn't negatively impact the passing air through the system in that negative pressure way that was detrimental to the system, at least what our results did show us. I think better for heat dissipation, better for internal temperature maintenance, and definitely better for maintaining the temperature inside that closed little area that the SSD lives within. Temperatures are still going to rise, but they certainly don't rise as quickly as they do inside that closed system. And that's really it for me. This test has been looking at that Sabrent heatsink right there for a couple of games and heavy write, heavy read. As I mentioned at the intro, we will be comparing it against this the big fat Sabrent there that I do still recommend, but it has to be said that in terms of interrupting airflow inside the system, there's definitely a case there. And of course, I'm going to be doing that comparison against first-party heatsinks later on with this with the WD. These tests take a while. I've got to say these are not the quickest tests that I can run, so I do apologise if this doesn't come immediately quickly, but it will arrive. If you have enjoyed this video, click like. It helps me understand what you guys like. If you want to learn more or be kept abreast when that lands, hopefully I'll get this out before the launch of this system, I think this arrives on what, like the 13th, I think, of October, depending on where you are in the world. I'll try and get another update on this before then, so you guys have then got all the information at hand before you click the purchase or go elsewhere. And of course, I thank you so much for watching this. There's links in the description to all of the parts that I've talked about today, and of course my recommended heatsink guides, recommended SSD guides, and of course all of the performance testing I've been doing up until this point. I have had a heavy few days doing this. I'm going to go take a break. I might even play a game. I will see you next time.